Today is July the 3rd, 2001. I live in Atlanta, Georgia.
What were your initial feelings about enlisting?
Well, we all felt like we had to do something. And I joined the enlisted reserves at Georgia, and almost at the University of Georgia, and almost everybody I knew did the same. They joined some, whether it's the Air Force or the Navy or whatever, but everybody was enlisting, and I had no qualms about it.
What about your family?
Well, I didn't ask them. I told them, and at some later date, my dad, before I went overseas, my dad made the remark that I imagine many fathers did, and he said he wished he could go in my stead. He'd been in World War One, and so. But back in those days, everybody, almost everybody, was for let's get this thing done.
What year did you enlist?
I joined the enlisted reserves at Georgia in 1942, and it was in my freshman year at Georgia.
When we backtrack just a little bit, where did you grow up?
I grew up. You said I grew. You asked where I grew up. I grew up in Edenton, Georgia. That's Eatonton. I don't know, as we used to say, Edenton, Georgia. I went to Edenton High School, and lived there all my life until I moved to Atlanta.
Go ahead.
I guess we'll just backtrack. Where did your initial training take place?
Okay, you asked where my initial training took place. I was inducted at Fort McPherson here in Atlanta, and then after about a 5-day train ride out to Fort Riley, Kansas, and I was there for 13 weeks for basic training.
Tell us a little bit about what your basic training consisted of.
Well, you want to know a little bit about what my basic training consisted of? Well, to start with, Fort Riley, Kansas is something that was new. You understand, I'd never been out of the state of Georgia, but maybe once to the World's Fair in New York when I was a kid, and maybe we took some trips to Florida, but to go to Kansas was just like going to another world. Didn't have to have a passport, but we were on something called Republican Flats, and this was just a very flat area. And when it rained, when it didn't rain, it was dust everywhere. In fact, I've got to get off on a tangent just a little bit. We arrived there on a Sunday morning, and we were, sent to our barracks, which was and these were these tar paper barracks that wasn't built very tight anyway, wooden floor and tar paper sides, one story. And you went inside and the dust was just flowing inside. And they issued us our rifles, and these rifles came right out of the crate, and they were covered with cosmoline. Well, cosmoline is something kind of like, what Vaseline is like. Well, that's kind of like what these rifles, it didn't smell the same, but that's what these rifles were. And can you imagine those rifles covered with this gook and this dust flowing around? And we were told the first thing we had to do was to clean them. And you'd think we almost going to use them like sandpaper with that dust, but at any rate, so we did it. And our barracks was right next to the mess hall, so we had the mess sergeant as one of our, in our barracks. That's another story. I'll tell you about him later. But at any rate, we had, I guess you'd say, oral instruction, sit around and we would talk this, that, and the other. We had a lot of marching, and I guess this was to develop discipline. I'll never forget. There's a squeaky little guy from somewhere up in upstate New York was in this group, and we were sitting around, and they said, now whatever the sergeant says do, you do. And he says, even if he says go out in that field and pick up that pile of you know what and bring it back. He used more words, but anyway, I'll be polite. And he says, yeah, you pick up that stuff and you bring it back here, and you do it right now. So, you know, any rate, when it rained, though, and it didn't rain that often, when it did, all this dirt changed into gumbo mud, and you could walk, and you could marching in that, you could almost lose your boots. Just, you know, stick to it. Kansas, as you may know, is known for its tornadoes. And we were sitting in the barracks one morning getting so-called instructions on this, that, or the other, how to dismantle and do your rifle. And somebody says there's a tornado coming, and we all ran out of the barracks and crawled into a ditch or whatever we could find. And one came by, and it was, well, it wasn't big. I think it took a little bit of something off and went over our heads, but that was it. But that was, you know, a new experience. One other quickie, we had a lot of calisthenics, and you know what a jumping jack is, where you throw your arms up and your feet out and back down and up. Well, the sergeant or whoever it was stood up on the top of a dike, and we were all out on this flat area in front of him, and he was giving instructions, and it was raining like you wouldn't believe. And we had our raincoats up, and so every time you threw your arms up, you get an arm full of rain, and back down. And back then, by the way, the officers still rode horses out there. This was a cavalry post, even though we were infantry basic. This was a cavalry post. So this officer came riding out, rode up on the dike, and says, "Get these men in." We were all delighted. So, at any rate. So, one other thing, we went out on a bivouac one night. You know what a bivouac is? It's where you go out and you stay in tents, and you act like you're on maneuvers or something. We had what they call shelter halves. Each person had a half of a tent, and you got two together, and that made a tent. And little low pup tents that were right down low on the ground. And somehow or another, I ended up with the company captain and the sergeant. And there's three of us in that tent, and I heard the captain say, "Don't look now, but I think there's water coming in under the tent." And you know, I didn't know what to do. And he said, "Don't worry. It'll in a few minutes my heat will dry it out." So at any rate, that's kind of what basic training was like. We had a beer. There was a beer garden. Of course, I didn't drink beer. I never had any whiskey or beer in my life. We didn't do that at my home. I learned about that later, but originally hadn't. At any rate, but the mess sergeant would go in and he'd drink his full of beer, and he'd come in after lights were out, and the hut was long, narrow, with a row of beds on either side, bunks on either side, and a footlocker in front of each one. And there were 2 or 3 pot-bellied stoves. These are big stoves straight up and down with a pipe running up the front. And they were, you know, spaced along the middle of the aisle. And the sergeant would come in at night, loaded, and he'd fight his way down through those stoves. It was not, you know, it was not cold weather, so the stoves were not heated. And sometimes the stoves would win. He'd knock the pipes down, and they'd sud all over him. Anyway, so that's my answer.
What was your first assignment?
Well, I don't know how to answer where was my first assignment. We had basic training. Then we went to I was as an infantry replacement. We went from there to Camp Butner, North Carolina, where I was given a 7-day or whatever it was furlough at home before going overseas. And then from there, I must tell you this, Atlanta back then had 2 train stations. They may have had the third one out here at Brookwood Station, but they had 2 main stations, Terminal Station and Union Station. They were right up the hill. One was right up the hill from the other. And I let my folks know that I was going to be arriving at such and such a time in the morning on such and such a day. I didn't tell them which station. So when I got here, they were much out of breath going back and forth between the 2 stations. That's the first thing they told me about. After Camp Butner, was sent to Fort Meade, Maryland, to get issued, equipment and whatnot for going overseas, a rifle and clothing, and I had to have GI glasses. I'd had some rimless ones or whatnot, but that wasn't the kind I had to have some with metal rims and whatever. The kind the kids like a few years later, but any rate, and I stayed there for a few weeks, and before I guess we went out of the port of New York. I don't know exactly. It may have been Shenango or something of that sort, but I'm not. All I know is we loaded onto a ship. And I'm not sure I'm answering your question, Amy.
You are. That's fine.
Okay.
Did you know when you left New York? Did you know where you were headed?
Well, we knew we were going to Europe.
Okay.
We went on the Empress of Australia was the name of the ship. Now, it's my belief, and I'm not sure about this, but that the ship had been a German cruise liner, one of the nice big liners, and it had been taken over, captured by the British, and renamed. And it was totally loaded with GIs. I mean, we were supposed to share each bunk in 3s. Everybody would get to, each bunk had to have 3 people, not at the same time, but in shifts. And people were sleeping in the companionways, some on bunks, some of them. I found a place, like a lot of other people, I found a place on deck. And I went the whole trip over on deck. I had my little spot. A lot of other people had theirs. And, you were responsible for all your personal gear, but nobody, I think, was going to take it anyway. But so except for going down for meals or to the head, I stayed right on deck. And the weather wasn't bad. We went over right at the end of October, landed in Liverpool on about the 5th of November of 44. That be right? No, 43. And so it was, I'd never heard of a CB before. Those were civilian engineers of some sort that did bridges and whatnot. They were civilians, but they were in the military, and there was a whole group of those on board. They were sleeping on the deck too. And I guess because of the Gulf Stream, it wasn't really that cold. So.
I know. Was the crew of the ship, were they English? Or
Yeah.
American?
They were English, and you want to know about the crew of the ship. They were, what little I saw of them, they were English. One thing I remember was that we had English sausage for breakfast, and that stuff had a lot of meal in it. But funny how you remember these things. But and I guess that's where I was introduced to kippers. I like them now, by the way. Any rate, so, but the crew I believe was all English.
Now, go ahead, I'm sorry.
No, that's all right, go ahead.
had you been given your assignment yet? Did you know where you were?
No,
what
no.
your-
I was strictly a infantry replacement.
Okay, so you had not been assigned to a unit.
That's correct.
Okay, and when you got to Liverpool, where did you go from there?
Okay. You asked where we went from Liverpool. From Liverpool, we went to a place called Feezy Farms. Now, I don't know whether that was somebody named Feezy or what, but it was a large, I guess transit type camp. Excuse me, where we were assigned from there, and we stayed there. Oh, I stayed there because you went in with a whole group of people, and you never knew who went where from there. I was assigned to the 5th Infantry Division, and I guess I was at Feezy Farms for maybe 2 days. Interestingly enough, while there, I'd always heard about London fog, or English fog, and that sound kind of strange or whatnot, but in Eden, Georgia, where I grew up, we didn't have any fog like that. But I learned about it there. It was so thick that really you could hold your hand up, hold your arm out, and couldn't see your hand. So that again was another new experience for a farm boy. But we went from there to County Down, Warren Point, in County Down in Northern Ireland. Now, as you may remember, Northern Ireland and Southern Ireland were totally separate. Southern Ireland was another country, and they were supposedly neutral, even though they really were leaning toward the Germans. And Northern Ireland, of course, was part of the British Empire, and that's where they were stockpiling, if you please, people getting ready for the invasion. So that was around the early part of November, and I stayed in Warren Point until going over to France on July the 10th or the 9th of the next year.
Okay. Now, the guys that you had crossed with over to Liverpool, since you went as replacements, did most of them go to the same unit, or did you ever even see those guys again?
Never saw them again.
Really?
Never saw them again. While we was at the couple of days we were at Feezy Farms, always liked solitaire for some reason, and used to play it, the one card up, and there was some guy there that I think I lost $3 million to, but it didn't really matter because I never saw him again. But
That's a good thing.
at any rate, but I was assigned to the 5th Infantry, and before going overseas, I had been told I was going to be a corporal for purposes of whatever going over. So I had 2 stripes, and that's what we really referred to as a saltwater corporal. We got over there and was lined up in front of the first sergeant at the company where I was assigned to, and he was looking down the line and he says, "Boy, what are you doing with them stripes?" And I says, "I don't know." And I reached up and I yanked them things off right quick. That guy looked like a mountain standing in front of me. He scared me to death. I'll never forget Sergeant Boyk.
Well, so you went in with the 5th Division when they went into France, which
Yeah.
would have been in July.
Yeah, we landed July the 10th, which was just about a month after the invasion. But of course, it meant that I was in Ireland, in Northern Ireland, with the 5th training and whatnot for about 9 months, which was an interesting time too. So
Take us through that a little bit.
Okay. You want to know a little bit about that? Well, to start with, Warren Point and County Down. County Down is right on the southern edge of Northern Ireland. Give you a few minutes on this if you don't mind.
That's fine.
The Warren Point was a battalion area, which meant that when you were off duty, you had freedom to roam the the town. And we were billeted in, the platoon I was in was billeted in a so-called 3-story guest house that had been divided down the middle, and on one side was civilians, and it was totally divided. There's no connection whatsoever. Even the backyard was separated. And the other side was, our platoon was in. And I don't know, there were 4 or 5, maybe 6 people to a room. I forgot, double-decker bunk beds. One thing I do remember on payday, I never learned to shoot crap, but at the foot of my bed, they were shooting crap all night long. But and we had one guy there by the name of Hager. He was from somewhere in West Virginia. And Hager, I guess he must have been a pretty good marksman. He probably learned to shooting squirrels out of trees somewhere, but they made him a sharpshooter. But he would lay on his bunk when he was off duty. He'd lay on his bunk all the time. That's all he ever did, except on payday night. He'd lose all his money, and he'd get back on his bunk again. That was Hager. But we would go out and do night problems and up into the hills and whatnot. And I always it was interesting to me that the Army had done a good job of conditioning us, because you'd sit there and it never got too cold. It got cold enough for an overcoat, but it never snowed. The frost would be an inch or inch and a half deep sometimes, but no snow, and a lot of mist and rain. You just got to the point where a little mist was just normal, but you'd sit there and, pardon the expression, but your nose would drip, and whatnot, but you didn't catch a cold. One of the funny things was that we would be out on the hillside, and after you got settled down and be put into position and so forth, the farmers all were ready for us. Some guy would ease out and go to a farmhouse. They'd find one close by, and the farmers had boiled eggs. Now, we never saw any chickens, but you'd buy, for a pound note, you'd get a dozen hard-boiled eggs, and they were so good. And I don't know where they got them, but there was always eggs. But we did one night. I probably should tell you that I didn't realize it at the time, but I had a condition, I still have, of course, and will always have, called retinitis pigmentosa, which causes you to lose your peripheral vision. And in fact, today, and for a long time now, I've been legally blind. But any rate, I'll tell you, that's another story later down the line. But one night, it was a nice moonlight night. We were going on a night problem, and we were in a long single file with, I guess, the whole company strung out in one long file, and going up in that part of Northern Ireland, well, I guess probably all of Ireland, the fields are divided up in these little low stone walls, and maybe 10 acres, maybe more, maybe less, but at any rate, and so we were going along. We got to one, and the guy in front of me crawled over it, headed on up way, and I got to it, and I started crawling over, and I dropped my rifle, and I reached down to pick it up, and as I got over the wall, and I looked up, and I saw the guy in front of me, and I started following, but he kind of veered off to the right, but I followed him anyway, and a little bit I realized I was following a sheep. And I was about to lead the whole crowd into Southern Ireland, where we'd been interned. But so I realized my mistake, and I was able to pick out the moon came out from behind a cloud or something, and I was able to, because night blindness is part of this condition, you see, and so I was able to catch up, but so you never know. The town was, as I say, was a battalion area. The mess hall for the battalion was the little railroad station. They had converted the dining room there to a large mess hall or whatever. And just outside of it was kind of like a little bit of a town square. And sometimes, once in a while, you'd see some guys would come through with a tank, and they'd park it there in that square, and they'd go in the mess hall. And you'd see some little guy with a cap pulled down way over his eyes, cigarette hanging off the edge of his mouth, walking around, looking at it sideways and walking all around, taking it all in, and you just knew this guy was probably with the Irish, what do you call the IRA? Never mounted anything, but you just figured that. I had a very nice experience. I have to be careful how I tell this. I was out one evening walking after we're not doing a night problem, and after being off duty, on this walkway along the lock that was across the street from where we were billeted. And it was a nice walk, and there was a very attractive young lady, kind of, looked a good bit like Amy McDaniel. And she was walking, ignoring me, and I kept following her, and eventually I got her attention, and we got to be friends. And it turned out that she was living with some cousins of hers. She was about the same age I was, obviously. And, this was, 19 years old, thereabouts. And she was living with some cousins, real old people. I think they were probably 60 years old or something. But they lived around, interestingly enough, around on the street, behind the street I was billeted on. And you walked up our street and down an alley and back down, and you were at the house. And that got to be a very friendly situation that I spent 9 months almost. It was made my stay in Northern Ireland very, very nice. But so we had a false start heading for France. We hiked or marched over to the rail station with all of our gear, and then we turned around and sent back to our billet. And then a day or two later, while we were still all on alert, and I back up again. One other thing. We were on a night problem, and just about daylight, a runner came out and told the officers in charge about the invasion. And this was the first we knew of it. And first we knew it had happened, of course. And from that time on, we began to be preparing and getting ready, and not knowing when, but just knowing we would be heading for France sometime soon.
Now, what was your job within the platoon?
I was a private in the rear rank. You asked what my job was. One thing, I was issued rifle grenades. I don't know if you have any idea what a rifle grenade is. You may. It's a long thing about this long with fins on the back, and back in those days, I don't know what they look like now, but it had like a little football on the front end that had the explosive in it, and you had a tube that you fitted on the front of your rifle, and this thing sat down over it. Well, myself and one other person, we issued these in the platoon, and they took us out to a quarry somewhere, and they said, okay, you each have one rifle grenade to fire, and that was our training on it. And had this satchel with a dozen of these things, and you used a blank, and I always wondered if you made a mistake and put a live round in instead of a blank round, what was going to happen. At any rate, somehow or another I lost that bag somewhere along the line after I got overseas. Got to France, I think. But we did not have to go in a fighting area. I guess you'd like me to go ahead and kind of going into landing. Well, we went over, I don't know how long it took, I guess. It was not that long, but we were in Ireland and had to go around the tip of England and across the channel. But we landed on Utah Beach, which was relatively flat. And we went down rope ladders off the side of the ship, and these were like real big fishnets, I guess you might say. But the ropes were maybe that big around, and with squares maybe like that. And you climbed down with all your gear hanging off of you onto a landing craft that was going up and down. They're not like they use today, where they can go right up on land. These things were, and we climbed down, and nobody fell off, so and that was lucky, I guess. And when it could not go all the way to the beach, but almost to the beach. So we virtually walked in on dry land. And this was, excuse me, this was July the 10th of 44. And so the fighting was already pretty far inland. This was on the Cherbourg Peninsula, but the fighting was fairly well in. In fact, contrary to the way wars were fought before and the wars were fought afterward, it was more or less a static line. And the line would move forward like that. And the line was stuck at that time. You've heard maybe of the city of St. Lo on the Cherbourg Peninsula in France. Well, the Germans were holding St. Lo, and the Germans were holding St. Lo, and the Americans were trying to take it. And the Americans pushed the Germans out, and the Germans pushed the Americans back out, and so forth, about 3 times before we finally took it. In the meantime, we had gone in and taken over for the 2nd Infantry Division, and taken over their holes, their what do you call it, foxholes. So we didn't have to dig foxholes. And this was in hedgerow country. So similar a little bit to that Northern Ireland, except that this, instead of having stone walls, they were, I don't know if you know what hedgerows are or not, but they're like dirt banks with a lot of growth on top of them. Sometimes it's just bushes, sometimes big trees and whatnot, but this again is the way the fields were divided up. And we sat in this area for about 12 days waiting for the line to begin to move forward. And where we were kind of in farmyards, or part of it was. So and during the day everything was quiet where we were. And you'd see 2 guys go out, one of them with a rifle looking up in the trees like this, looking for snipers, and the other one looking in hen nests for eggs. And we found out the French had buried some, I don't know whether it was Benedictine or cognac or what it was, but we found some of that, and that stuff was really potent. Like I say, I'd never had a drink in my life, but then, I guess I did taste some of that. At any rate, it turned out that stuff was pretty good for cleaning your rifle, for putting in a canteen cup and lightening and boiling eggs, making coffee. You could do almost anything with that stuff. It was pure alcohol is what it was, I think. In fact, the aid station every once in a while would get some guys being brought in that they were just completely out. They'd had too much of it. But at any rate, there was, unfortunately, you see a lot of, dead animals around and whatnot that were in a very bad condition by then, but you got, used to that. The Germans knew that we were there, knew where we were. And at night, a German patrol, we would be, right by our foxholes would be like an outpost or whatnot right behind a hedgerow, and the hedgerow was kind of protecting it. And the Germans would send a patrol around, and they'd come around the flank somehow or another and get past and come around the hedgerow behind us and then shoot automatic rifles down toward where we were, with the idea they wasn't really aiming at anybody, hoping that if we returned the fire, then that would give the people with the artillery would know where we were and they could open up. Well, we never did. Interestingly enough, incidentally, we would hear artillery shells going, our own artillery shells going over our head. And it was like a motorboat going through water. It's an interesting sound. It's these shells going, through the air. But one night, the Germans did that, and during that day, a British recon unit had been pulled into that on our flank, and the Germans pulled that foolishness with them, and they were not reserved as we were. All hell broke loose, if you'll pardon the expression. The Germans never pulled that again. they really. One night, you've heard of the V1 or V2 bombs that the Germans used to the British. Mm-hmm. Well, one night I heard this thing sound like a Model A truck or a washing machine or something coming cluck, cluck, cluck overhead, and all of a sudden the noise stopped. And about 2,000 feet away from where I was, the most outstanding explosion you ever heard, ever saw. I mean, there were red flames and dirt and all this stuff up in the air. And what it was one of these things that misfired, and it hit. And the next day went over to where it had hit, and there was a crater there that you could have put a small bungalow in. It didn't hurt me, but it was a little shocking, I guess you might say. Another night, one of the other platoons, thought that they had some German infiltrators, and they went ahead and opened up on them, and they got return fire, and there was a firefight that went on all night long. There's no artillery, but small arms fire back and forth. And next morning, it quieted down about sunup, and people started looking to see about casualties. And there was no German casualties, there was no American casualties, but there were a couple of big pigs had been wandering around, and that's what they thought was the Germans. And they'd been shooting at each other, but we had barbecue. I don't mean to be making light of the war, but these are just things that happen.
Now, when you were in the hedgerow country, when you did have to advance through the hedgerows, can you tell us how that was accomplished?
Well, it wasn't easy, and when you think about it, you want to know how we advanced through the hedgerows. Well, when you think about it, when you are the advancing party, you've got to go through an opening somehow. You couldn't go over these things because all the stuff on top. And when you're on the other side of the coin, you're protecting, then you've got the advantage of having this protection. So, of course, obviously the farmers, when they had them, they had to have a way of getting around them. So we would have to go around the ends of them or whatnot where they had gaps. The engineers developed something not too far into the hedgerow problem of putting a big blade, like a bulldozer blade, on the front of a tank. And they would just bulldoze their way through them, which helped a good bit. I never had too much of that experience because I got captured pretty shortly after we started moving forward. And so that's another whole world.
Tell us, take us through the hedgerows up until,
Okay, well, as I say, we were in a holding position for about 12 days there. And then on July the 27th of 44, finally the Americans had broken through and kept Germans out of St. Lo, and we were east of St. Lo in the so-called Scheer sector. And in France, I found out later they call it Caen. But at any rate, sounded like Scheer to me, but at any rate, it was Caen. We were in the Caen sector. At any rate, my platoon was in a, what do you call it, a support position rather than in the lead position. And as we started moving forward, as we got a ways into it, one other thing, I was along with I'm getting ahead of myself. I'll never forget, we were right at one spot and right beside a very high bank. And all of a sudden, these GIs came tumbling over the bank, just running as best they could. And they said, look out, we've been zeroed in, the 88s, and the shells started falling. And I mean, this was a huge bank, and it was just knocking the end out completely. It just, one GI came along there, and he had a German prisoner with him. He was taking him back for interrogation, and the shells started falling, and he was trying to tell the German he's got to get down, and he finally says, "Bzzz," and the German got the idea, and they got that. It's funny, on the front lines like that, it's at least along about that time, people are not mean to each other. Now, I think they got meaner later, but at that point, you're going to kill somebody, you're going to kill them. But being dirty wasn't necessarily, I mean, they may have come up with dirty tricks later, but at that point, let's face it, we were all kids, 18, 19 years old, and so forth. At any rate, the company commander, who I was not really particularly very fond of, as I guess a lot of people were not fond of that level of authority. But at any rate, he got hit, and I mean he got really badly hit, his lower extremities and whatnot. And I got grabbed along with 3 other guys to carry him back to the aid station. And just about that time, the company exec was there or something, and he looked down and he says, God, he's gone. Give me something to cover his face with. Well, I was wearing a field jacket, which was a little light field jacket, and a shirt. And so I didn't like the guy, but I took my shirt off and put it over him, and we carried him out. He was dead. This leads to something else. So, at any rate, after I got back to the company, and by the way, I'd always wanted a .45 pistol. That thing looked really interesting. So, I picked up his. The officers had those, and after I had it for about an hour, I got rid of it. That thing was heavy. I didn't want it anymore. So. But a little later on, after I got back to, this is all part of the same day now, after I got back to the unit, again, since we were in the reserve position, I guess is why, along with a group of other guys, I was called to go do an ammunition detail, which meant we had to go back to the rear and load up with ammunition and bring it back to the front. Well, now, you know the Mexican banditos that we see in the movies with the bandoliers, that's what these were. These were kind of cloth things with a whole bunch of M1 rifle clips in them, and you loaded up, I don't know, as many as you could carry, hang them over your shoulder and whatnot. But walking back to get them, one guy had a carbine or a rifle, one or the other, had it slung over his shoulder, hanging down, All of a sudden heard a rifle fire and looked around. This guy had missed, but he'd tried to shoot his toe off, but didn't make it. So he stayed in. I missed one thing. I should back up and tell you if I can. While we were on in the holding position, one night I was on so-called guard duty, and we had a bayonet on the rifle. And the bayonets were just little short things about that long with a good sharp point on them. And they clipped on the rifle with just kind of as a catch. I don't know if you're familiar with the M1 rifles or not, and the way the bayonet's hooked onto them. But at any rate, next morning, when I was off duty, I went to remove the bayonet from the rifle, and I, went to take it off like that, and it hung, and then it turned loose, and when it did, it hit me right here, and didn't do any real damage, but I went to the aid. I was taken to the aid station, and this is interesting. This is something you probably would not be familiar with, but I got the doctor, treated that little bit of a minor wound and whatnot, but then he checked my eyes, I guess because it was all in that same area. And he came up with the fact that I had night blindness. Well, night blindness is one of the early symptoms of what we now know as retinitis pigmentosa, which causes you to lose your peripheral vision. I thought everybody ran over, stumps and walked into posts at night. And, who can see at night? Well, at any rate, he sent word back that I wasn't supposed to do any night duty. Well, the captain wasn't terribly happy about that. He said he'd heard of soldiers with backaches and foot aches, and headaches, but not night blindness. Back to duty. Well, I wasn't trying to get out of anything anyway, but so. One other little thing, I'll move on if you like for me to, but I'll tell you one other little thing. The way you cleaned your rifle was you had a string, you had a metal thong that was on the end of it, and you dropped the string through it, and then you put a little piece of cloth in the thong, and you would pull it through. But one evening I was doing that, and the string broke, and so I had this thong right in the middle of the barrel of the rifle. And just about that time, one of the sergeants came by and says, "You and you and you," and I was one of the U's. "Come on, we think there's an infiltrator in here, and we want to catch him." Well, if I had shot that rifle, it'd have blown up in my face, but fortunately I didn't have to do that. Anyway, so now it's at the point, if you'd like for me to.
How did just
Okay.
technical question? How did you get it out? How did you end up getting the patch?
I don't remember. I must have found. I guess there was a a rod that you could get to pump it, push it out. But that was in the daylight, I guess, the next morning. On the coming back to July the 27th again. As the line started moving forward, and we went back to get this ammunition detail, and we came back up to the hedgerow area that we were designated to come back to. And when we got there, and the people we were supposed to join were not there, and there was a company exec and a non-com, and there was about 16 of us all told. The Germans started dropping mortar shells. They'd drop them down this end of the hedgerow, and we'd run up to the other end, and then they'd drop them up there. They knew what they were doing, and then we'd run back this way. And a couple of guys got hit with shrapnel, and of course you understand that you were running with your head down anyway, because even though there was all this growth above the hedgerow, it still some rifle fire or small arms fire could come through it, and they were covering that with small arms fire. What had happened, the platoon on either side had pulled back, and we didn't know it. And when the Germans had us appropriately addled, if you want to call it that, they came around the end. And I was right at the very end up here, and all of a sudden I'm looking up, and this guy, and looking right down the barrel of an MG-34 German automatic rifle, and this guy was saying, "Hands up, my boy, hands up." And
Speaking in English?
he was saying that may be all the English he knew, but that was what he was saying, "Hands up, my boy." So, there wasn't a whole lot of choice at that point,
Sure.
and because he had his finger on that rifle, the automatic rifle, and so I dropped my rifle. I thought, well, that's too close. And I reached down and picked it up and threw it out a little bit farther. It's a wonder he didn't shoot me. But at any rate, they took us around behind to a kind of we walked past a stone wall that didn't have any growth on top of it, and they had a whole firing line, a machine gun and rifles and all this whole thing lined up there. And then there was a little stone barn right beside them with a kind of a gap between it. And they took us past that, back maybe 100 yards back to another little stone barn that, by now these things didn't have windows on them or whatnot, but that's where they had us back there to search. And first thing they were saying is, the soldiers were saying, "Cigarettes for the officers, cigarettes for the officers, cigarettes for the officers." And the officers would say, "Cigarettes for the men, cigarettes for the men." They really liked Lucky Strikes. I mean, that was really a big deal back then. Any rate, and we had our packs, and they were having a field day taking those packs off and looking through them and whatnot, and so-called searching us and whatever. And, what are you going to do? You're just standing there. And if you recall, I told you I'd given my shirt to the captain who was deceased. So I had this field jacket that was hanging down over my sleeve. And I had a watch on, I guess on this arm, that my mother and father had given me when I picked it up in Atlanta from my uncle at his jewelry store as I was going in when I went to Fort Mac to report in. And this was something very special back in 1943. It was a self-winding, shot-proof, waterproof. It was just really very special. Well, the Germans, since I had my arms down like that, they didn't see it. So because they would have taken it if they had. But just about that time, they got word that they needed 2 prisoners to come up to the firing line, because we found out later because they had a wounded guy in this little barn up there, and they wanted us to carry him out. But we started, they said, you and you, and I was one of the yous, and the other one was a Mexican kid, a Mexican descent kid. And we started running up there, at this point, whatever, at any rate. And about that time, a whole hail of small arms fire started coming across from the American side. And the Germans were waving, "Get down, get down, get down." Well, I didn't feel anything. This other kid didn't either. We just kept going. And we got up behind this firing line, and they were trying to tell us to go in this barn, what they wanted to do. They wasn't speaking English, and we couldn't understand what the jabbering they were doing. And finally, I don't know if there was an officer or a non-com, got up, came over there, took out his P-38, whatever that pistol was, and pointed, and we got the idea right quick. we went in this little barn, and there was this German soldier laying there on some hay. He had a big hole in his shoulder and a lot of stuff coming out of it. Pardon the gore, but at any rate. And we were standing there trying to decide what to do. And about that time, a mortar shell hit the side of the barn and set it on fire. Well, this guy didn't need any help. He got up, he came out of there in a hurry. And he took off on his own. So we just went back out, and about that time they brought up the rest of the group and headed us on out, walking on out back toward the rear. As we were, there was a little lake out there. It was really a pretty setting. There was a little lake out there, and I think I saw one of our airplanes coming in and loosen a couple of bombs, but that's just vague in my memory. So from there they took us back to the rear.
Okay. We were, we'd stopped off where you were headed back to the rear lines after you had been initially captured.
Right. I need to back up a moment.
Okay.
And forgive me, I seem to forget these things along the way, I guess. But I'm Jewish, and my dog tags, my American dog tags, had a P on them for Protestant by mistake. And so while I was at Camp Butner, North Carolina, before going overseas, I wanted to correct this. So I had the first sergeant, or somebody, the supply sergeant, I guess it was, took one of these markers and changed it to an H for Hebrew. Well, it didn't occur to me that this could be pretty fatal, because the Germans were not really, they didn't really kind of go for Jews over there. Well, not in the same way, at any rate. So I'll tell you about this a little later. But at any rate, so coming back to as I say, we were headed to the rear, and we walked us back. And the first night they stopped us at some little French farmhouse, and there was a outshed of some sort, and I don't know how many there was of us, maybe. Well, we left some guys back there where they originally searched us, because a couple of them, 3 of them were wounded, and I guess they took them some other way. But they walked us back, and they spent, I guess it was 14, I don't know how many of us. At any rate, in this little barn, and I'll never forget one of the Germans came out with some barbed wire and a hammer and some staples, and we had to help him seal up the windows so we couldn't get out. Unbeknownst to the Germans, since they didn't search me, and at this point I wasn't really being overly brave, I guess, I had a hand grenade in my pocket, but I never had an opportunity to really, and I didn't really want it to be found on me at that, and a hunting knife on my leggings. So I found a place to dispose of both of them in that barn that night, just by taking them, just leaving them in a corner. There is a point where there's no point in being suicide about things. At any rate, so the next day we got back on the road, and all the time they kept adding prisoners. Some of them, I never forget seeing these guys that had been shot down, been flyers and shot down, and with these wool-lined boots and wool-lined jackets. And this was in July, and I guess they didn't have really real boots on. They just had these things on. At any rate, we stopped at around noontime. We stopped at a little house, and I guess the Germans told the French people that they had to give us some food. I don't know if the Germans provided them some or not, but at any rate, we went into this house, and there looked like maybe 2 or 3 women, and I noticed that one younger person, I'd say she was probably 15 or 7, maybe she was 17, 18 years old, kept trying to motion one of the guys to go down these steps. She was going to try to help him escape, and he never did either get the message or whatnot. But then we went on, and we were loaded onto trucks heading for Reims, France, and we got diverted at one point. They had some train cars, freight cars, under some parked under some trees. That way, I guess our fighter pilots, our pilots couldn't see them, and they wanted some people to unload them, and so they were like great big paper bags. That was no big deal. we'd carry these bags on our shoulders and put them wherever they wanted them, unloading these 2 or 3 freight cars. And right in the middle of while we were doing it, the Germans started hollering, "Fleer, fleer, fleer." And what it was some American airplanes were coming over, and they wanted us to get, under the trees or under the cars to get out of the way so they wouldn't be seen. After we finished that, we finally got back on our trucks and were taken to Reims, where we were loaded on to, well, before then, you have to stop me for this, I'm sorry. But before then, we were in a little town. I guess this is where maybe they loaded us on the trucks. We were right in the middle of the town square. And by now there was a whole lot of POWs, because we accumulated them as we went along the way. At any rate, and we were standing there, and the French civilians were across the street. And every once in a while, one would run across the street